Isabel surveyed the garage with the triumphant air of a conquering general. Her gaze swept past the gleaming shell of the silver convertible and the hulking silhouette of the black SUV, both of which were now legally, spiritually, and soon to be physically hers. Her victory was almost complete. All that remained was the refuse of a life she was so eager to discard. Her eyes, cold as polished stone, landed on the far corner. There, stacked against the wall, was a chaotic jumble of what she charitably called her husband's projects. Rolled-up tubes of drafting paper, some yellowed with age, were crammed into a plastic bin. Miniature, intricate models of buildings, crafted from balsa wood and cardboard, sat collecting a fine layer of dust on a rickety folding table. It was the detritus of a failed dream, the sad physical evidence of her husband Leo's decade-long stagnation. She pointed a manicured finger, the diamond on her ring catching the single bare bulb's light. "Make sure the movers take everything of value," she instructed the grim-faced foreman. Then, with a dismissive wave toward the corner, she added, "And just leave all that old trash. He can deal with it himself. It's all he has left, anyway." She thought this was the final cutting remark in a war she had decisively won. She believed she was leaving a broken man in a hollowed-out house, surrounded by the worthless symbols of his mediocrity. What Isabel didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her world of glittering surfaces, was that the old trash in the corner was not a monument to failure. It was a crucible of genius, and it was worth precisely $2 million. Within 6 weeks, that pile of trash would not only dismantle her entire world, but would also force her to confront the devastating truth of what and who she had so carelessly thrown away. This story is about the blindness of arrogance and the quiet power of true worth. So many of us have felt underestimated, and the feeling of eventual vindication is one we all crave. If you've ever felt that way, hit that like button and subscribe, because this journey is for you. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the beginning of the end. The final fracture had occurred not with a shout, but with the clink of silverware against fine china. It happened 3 months earlier at the polished mahogany table of Isabel's parents, Richard and Eleanor. These dinners were a bi-monthly ritual of quiet judgment, a tribunal where Leo's perceived inadequacies were placed on trial without a single direct accusation ever being uttered. Richard, a man who had built a moderately successful regional insurance firm, saw the world as a simple ledger of profits and losses. He carried himself with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never once questioned his own assumptions. Eleanor, draped in tasteful silks and understated gold, was the family's social arbiter, her approval a currency more valuable and far more difficult to obtain than any of Richard's money. For 10 years, Leo had sat at this table, a quiet guest in the grand theater of their lives. He was an architect, a profession they found nebulously artistic and therefore commercially suspect. In the early years of his marriage to Isabel, when he worked for a large, respectable firm, they had tolerated it. But 5 years ago, he had made the unforgivable error of going out on his own. He had left the security of a steady paycheck to pursue his own designs, his own vision. In their eyes, he had not started a business. He had embraced a hobby. That night, the topic was Marcus, the son of one of Richard's golf partners. Marcus had just been made junior vice president at a brokerage house. 29 years old, Richard announced, slicing into his filet mignon with surgical precision. The boy has a real head for numbers, a real go-getter, understands how the world works. The statement hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken comparison. Leo felt its weight settle on his shoulders. He continued eating his own meal, his expression placid. He had learned long ago that engaging with Richard's loaded pronouncements was a fool's errand. It was like wrestling with a fog. There was nothing to grab onto, only a pervasive dampness that chilled you to the bone. Eleanor chimed in, her voice a delicate flute of concern. It's just so wonderful to see young people with ambition, with a clear path. It gives them such stability. She glanced at her daughter, a look of shared sympathy passing between them. Isabel, who had been pushing a single asparagus spear around her plate, sighed theatrically. Well, not everyone can be a go-getter, Mother. Some people are more creative. The word creative was wielded not as a compliment, but as a diagnosis of a charming but ultimately fatal condition. It was the word she used to explain to her friends why they didn't take lavish European vacations every year, why their house wasn't in the more exclusive gated community on the other side of town, why Leo drove a sensible sedan instead of a German sports car. Leo placed his fork and knife together on his plate. He looked from Richard's smug satisfaction to Eleanor's pitying gaze, and finally to his wife's carefully constructed mask of martyrdom. In that moment, something within him, a cord of patience that had been fraying for years, finally snapped. But it did not snap with a loud report. It parted with a quiet internal hum, a shift in frequency that only he could perceive. He had spent a decade absorbing their condescension, swallowing their thinly veiled insults, and accepting the role of the gentle, unambitious dreamer they had cast for him. He did it for Isabel. He did it because he had once loved the vibrant, passionate woman she had been, and he kept hoping to find her again beneath the layers of social aspiration and material desire. But looking at her now, seeing the casual cruelty in her eyes, he realized that woman was gone. He was mourning a ghost. He felt a profound sense of calm descend upon him. It was the calm of a man who had finally accepted a long-avoided truth. "Marcus sounds like a fine young man," Leo said, his voice even and measured. "I wish him all the best." The simplicity of his response was an act of defiance. He refused to take their bait. He refused to defend his life, his choices, his work. He would no longer participate in his own humiliation. Richard, sensing his prey had slipped the trap, grunted. "It's about knowing what's important, Leo. Bricks and mortar are one thing, but assets, real assets, that's the game." He tapped his temple. "It's all up here." Leo met his father-in-law's gaze. For the first time, he didn't see a powerful patriarch. He saw a small, insecure man, terrified that the world was more complex than his simple ledger allowed. A man who built his sense of self-worth by diminishing others. "You're absolutely right, Richard," Leo said, and the sincerity in his voice was the most disarming weapon he possessed. "Knowing what's important is everything." The conversation faltered. Leo had refused to play his part. The rest of the dinner passed in a strained, uncomfortable silence. On the drive home, Isabel was a storm cloud of fury in the passenger seat. The silence in the car was louder than any argument. "You embarrassed me tonight," she finally said, her voice tight. "How did I do that?" Leo asked, his eyes fixed on the road. "By just sitting there, letting them talk about Marcus, about success, and you just sat there. You didn't even try to defend yourself. You made us look weak." "Defend myself from what, Isabel? From your father's opinion? I am not in a competition with a 29-year-old stockbroker." "No, you're not," she scoffed, the venom in her tone unmistakable. "You're not in a competition with anyone. You're not even in the game. You're on the sidelines playing with your little wooden blocks in the garage while the rest of the world moves on." The little wooden blocks. That was what she called his models. The intricate, scaled representations of his designs, the physical manifestations of his soul. He didn't respond. He simply drove, the rhythmic sweep of the headlights cutting through the darkness. When they arrived home, She got out of the car and slammed the door. He remained in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. He looked at the house they had built together, or rather, the house he had designed and she had decorated. He looked at the window of the garage where a faint light glowed. He had left the light on over his work table. In that corner, under that light, sat the culmination of 5 years of relentless, solitary work. It was a design for a skyscraper, a twisting organic structure that integrated green space and revolutionary energy systems. It was bold, it was visionary, it was everything Richard and Eleanor and now Isabel believed he was not. He had submitted it under a pseudonym to the most prestigious and competitive architectural competition in the world, the Sterling Prize. The prize was not just a handsome sum of money, it was a career-making, legacy-defining honor. He had told no one, not Isabel, not anyone. It was his secret, a seed of hope planted in the barren soil of their marriage. That night, sitting in the silence of his car, he knew. The seed was either going to wither and die, or it was going to break through the concrete. There was no longer any middle ground. The clinking of the silverware had been the sound of a countdown beginning, and the silence in the car was the sound of his acceptance. The game they thought he wasn't playing? It had already been won. They just didn't know it yet. The history of their marriage could be charted by the erosion of Isabel's respect for him. When they first met, she had been captivated by his passion. He was an architect who spoke of buildings not as structures of steel and glass, but as living organisms that breathed with the city and sheltered the souls within. She, a junior marketing associate at a fashion label, was drawn to his depth. A welcome contrast to the shallow, ambitious men she usually dated. He saw beauty in the world that she had never noticed. The graceful curve of a bridge, the interplay of light and shadow on a brick wall. He made her world feel bigger. They married in a flurry of optimism. He was a rising star at a top firm, and she was proud to be on his arm. She loved telling her friends, "Leo's an architect." It sounded sophisticated, important. But slowly, things began to change. Isabel's career in fashion marketing exposed her to a world of extravagant wealth and performative status. Her colleagues spoke of ski trips to Gstaad and summers in the Hamptons. They wore designer clothes not for their beauty but for their logos. Success, she learned, was not something to be felt, but something to be displayed. Her own ambitions shifted from doing interesting work to acquiring the symbols of a successful life. Leo's decision to leave his firm was the first major fissure. He explained it to her with fire in his eyes, speaking of creative compromise and the desire to build something that was truly his own. He wanted to create architecture that mattered, not just profitable, but soulless glass boxes. She tried to be supportive. She truly did. She hosted a small party for the launch of Leo Vance Architecture, and she smiled as he showed his friends the new logo he had designed. But in the quiet moments, a seed of fear took root in her heart. Security was being traded for a dream, and she was no longer sure she valued dreams. The first year was difficult. Leo poured all their savings into his fledgling company, working tirelessly from a makeshift office in their spare bedroom. The big commissions he hoped for didn't materialize. He took on small projects, a kitchen renovation here, a deck addition there. It paid the bills, but just barely. The pride in her voice when she said, "Leo's an architect," was replaced by a note of apology. "He's working for himself now," she'd say, a little too brightly. "It's a passion project." Her friends would nod with practiced sympathy, their eyes betraying their pity. He was no longer a rising star, he was a cautionary tale. The garage became his sanctuary, and, in Isabel's eyes, the primary exhibit of his failure. He moved his office there to be closer to his tools and models. The space slowly filled with the evidence of his work. Sketches were pinned to the walls. Books on structural engineering and urban planning were stacked high, and in the center of it all, his work table, which became an ever-evolving landscape of miniature cities. He would spend hours there, late into the night, lost in a world of his own making. Isabel grew to resent that garage. It was a black hole that swallowed her husband's time and energy, yielding no tangible results she could show off. It smelled of sawdust and glue, foreign scents that had no place in the perfumed, polished world she was trying to build for them. Her resentment manifested as 1,000 tiny cuts. "Are you still tinkering out there?" she'd ask, her tone making it sound like he was a child with a chemistry set. "Richard's firm just had their best quarter ever. He's taking Eleanor to Paris for their anniversary." The comparisons were constant, a slow drip of poison. He was measured against her friends' husbands, her father, a phantom ideal of success he could never match. Leo, for his part, endured it with a quiet, monastic patience. He knew he was on a different path. The small renovation projects, while not glamorous, were exercises in craft. He was honing his skills, refining his understanding of materials and space. But the real work, the work that consumed him, was the sterling prize submission. It was a project he called Helia, a name derived from the Greek word for the sun. It was a skyscraper, yes, but it was unlike any other. Its facade was a twisting lattice of photovoltaic panels and vertical gardens, designed to produce more energy than it consumed. Its internal structure was modeled on the Fibonacci sequence, creating spiraling atriums that brought natural light and air deep into the building's core. It was audacious, complex, and beautiful. It was his soul rendered in blueprint and balsa wood. He worked on it in secret after Isabel had gone to bed. The garage, a symbol of his failure to her, was his cathedral of creation. The little wooden blocks were not toys, they were sacred objects. He built a dozen iterations of the model, each one more refined than the last. He ran complex simulations on his computer, testing wind shear, light patterns, and energy efficiency. It was the most challenging and exhilarating work of his life. He kept it secret, not out of spite, but out of necessity. It was a fragile dream, and he could not bear to have it trampled by her casual disdain. It was his one, unassailable thing. The humiliation peaked in the months following the disastrous dinner at her parents' house. Isabel's resentment curdled into open contempt. She began to speak of their finances in terms of "my money" and "the money you cost us." It was a fiction. He had contributed consistently, if not lavishly, from his projects. But it was a fiction she needed to believe to justify the decision she was slowly making. She started going out more with her friends, a circle of equally dissatisfied wives. They would return late, laughing loudly, reeking of expensive wine, and a shared sense of grievance. Leo would be in the garage, and she wouldn't even bother to look in. One Saturday, she announced she was having friends over for brunch. "I'd appreciate it if you could make yourself scarce," she said, not looking at him. "And for God's sake, can you do something about the garage? It's embarrassing. Just move all your stuff to one corner and throw a tarp over it. It looks like a junk heap." A junk heap? He looked at the model of Helia, sitting in the center of the table, its delicate structure glowing under the work light. He saw the years of his life, the sum of his talent, the entirety of his hope. And she saw a junk heap. He didn't argue. He spent the morning carefully moving every blueprint, every model, every book to the far corner of the garage. He draped an old, dusty canvas tarp over the table, hiding his masterpiece from view. When her friends arrived, he heard their laughter from the backyard. He heard Isabel's voice, artificially bright. "Oh, the garage. Don't even look in there. That's Leo's little workshop. I've given up trying to get him to clean it out." He sat on a stool in the dim, quiet corner, the smell of sawdust his only company, and felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation was so complete, so profound, that it was no longer painful. It was clarifying. He was an object of her shame, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer live that way. He was not a junk heap, and soon the whole world would know it. In the weeks that followed, a chilling efficiency descended upon their household. Isabel, having made her decision, moved with the swift, unfeeling precision of a demolition expert. She was dismantling their life together, piece by piece. The first salvo was the arrival of a lawyer's letter. It was delivered by courier, a crisp, impersonal envelope that felt cold to the touch. Leo found it on the doorstep when he returned from a site visit for a small residential project. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Inside, the language was as sterile as the paper it was printed on. Irretrievable breakdown, dissolution of marriage. It was followed by a detailed and breathtakingly audacious preliminary list of demands. Isabel wanted the house. She wanted 70% of their liquid assets. She wanted lifetime alimony, citing her significant emotional and financial contributions to the marriage, and the detriment to her own career prospects caused by supporting his unprofitable business venture. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it almost made him laugh. She had reframed her own relentless social climbing as a noble sacrifice on the altar of his art. She had painted herself as a patroness, when in fact she had been the chief critic, the relentless voice of doubt. He read the document not with anger, but with a kind of detached fascination. It was a work of fiction, a narrative so completely divorced from reality that it was almost impressive. He folded the letter, placed it on his work table in the garage next to the shrouded model of Helia, and got back to work. While Isabel was consulting with her lawyer, a woman named Brenda who specialized in high-conflict divorces and wore her ruthlessness like a designer accessory, Leo was engaged in a different kind of preparation. His was quieter, less theatrical. One Tuesday afternoon, as he was sanding a piece of balsa wood for a detail on the Helia model, his phone rang. It was an international number, a string of digits he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made him answer. "Leo Vance?" a voice asked, crisp and British. "Speaking," Leo replied, his focus still on the delicate curve of the wood in his hand. "This is Alistair Finch, calling from the Sterling Foundation in London." Leo's hand froze. The sanding block fell from his fingers, landing silently on the dusty concrete floor. His heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm, began to hammer against his ribs. He had submitted the Helia proposal 6 months ago. The winners were supposed to have been notified by now. He had slowly, painfully, begun to accept that he hadn't made the cut. He had allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that Isabel and her parents were right, that his work was nothing more than a hobby. "Yes," he managed to say, his voice a dry whisper. "Mr. Vance, it is my distinct pleasure to be the first to congratulate you," Alistair Finch said, his voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. "Your design, Helia, has been unanimously selected by the board as the winner of this year's Sterling Prize." The world tilted on its axis. The dusty garage, the tarp-covered table, the scent of glue, it all receded into a distant haze. He leaned against the wall for support, his knuckles white. I don't know what to say." "No need to say anything just yet," Finch chuckled. "We were all simply astounded. It's the most innovative, forward-thinking piece of architecture we've seen in a generation. Mr. Sterling himself called it a paradigm shift in urban design. He is most eager to meet you." Mr. Sterling, the legendary Silas Sterling, a reclusive, visionary billionaire who had made his fortune in technology and then turned his attention to philanthropy and architecture. The Sterling Prize was his personal crusade to reshape the skylines of the world. To have his name spoken by the man himself was like a composer hearing that Beethoven admired his symphony. The prize, as you know, includes a grant of $2 million to facilitate the initial development phase, Finch continued as if discussing the weather. And, of course, the Sterling organization will be partnering with you to bring Helia to life. Our first proposed site is the new financial district in Dubai. They are very keen. Dubai, $2 million, a partnership with Silas Sterling. The words were like celestial bodies, too large and too bright to be comprehended all at once. They floated in the space around him, shimmering with impossible light. He thought of Isabel's lawyer's letter. He thought of her demand for alimony to compensate for his unprofitable venture. He thought of her pointing to his life's work and calling it trash. A slow, quiet smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of malice or revenge. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated vindication. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for dramatic irony. "Mr. Vance, are you still there?" "Yes," Leo said, his voice returning to him, now infused with a strength that had not been there moments before. "Yes, I'm here. What are the next steps?" Isabel, meanwhile, was growing ever more confident. Her lawyer, Brenda, had assured her it was an open and shut case. "He's a failed artist, Isabel," Brenda had said, tapping a pen on her legal pad. "The court will see him as the financially non-contributing party. He'll be lucky to walk away with his drafting table. We'll paint a picture of a long-suffering wife who supported her husband's whimsical fantasies until she could no longer afford to. It's a classic narrative. Judges eat it up." Emboldened by this, Isabel escalated her campaign. She had a locksmith come and change the locks on the house while Leo was out, forcing him to call her and humbly ask for a new key. She began moving her things out, not all at once, but in a slow, torturous procession. Each day, another piece of their shared life would vanish. A painting from the wall, a set of lamps, the good towels. She was erasing him. The ultimate power play came with the cars. The silver convertible and the black SUV were both registered in Leo's name. His strong credit and the down payments from his earlier corporate career had secured the loans. But Isabel had driven them exclusively. They were part of her costume, essential props in the play of her life. One afternoon, Leo received a call from his own lawyer, a mild-mannered man named George, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the aggression of Isabel's counsel. "Leo, I've just received a demand from Brenda," George said, his voice weary. "She's insisting that Isabel be given immediate and sole use of both vehicles. She's threatening to file an emergency motion, claiming you might dispose of marital assets." "She can have them," Leo said calmly. "What?" "Leo, they're worth over $150,000 combined. They're significant assets. We should fight this." "No," Leo insisted. "Let her have them. It's not important." George was flabbergasted, but he complied. The next day, 2 flatbed trucks arrived. Isabel stood on the lawn, arms crossed, directing the drivers with an air of regal authority. She didn't look at Leo, who watched from the living room window. She was taking her prizes. As the second truck pulled away, carrying the SUV, she performed her final inspection of the garage, the scene of her ultimate decree. She saw the tarped corner of junk and, with a final pitying glance, turned her back on the house and got into the waiting Uber that would take her to her new stylishly furnished apartment. She was free. She was victorious. She had taken everything that mattered. In the garage, beneath the canvas tarp, Leo's phone buzzed. It was an email from Alistair Finch. The subject line read, "Travel itinerary. Meeting with Mr. Sterling." The quiet preparation was over. The storm was about to break. The air in the conference room was cold and sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ambition. It was a room designed for conflict, a neutral territory where fortunes were won and lost. A long, dark wood table stretched down its center, flanked by 12 severe-looking leather chairs. At one end, a massive window offered a panoramic but emotionally distant view of the city skyline. Isabel sat at the head of the table, flanked by her parents and her lawyer, Brenda. They had arranged themselves like a royal court, a solid phalanx of entitlement. Isabel wore a sharp, cream-colored power suit, her armor for the day's battle. Richard was puffed up with paternal righteousness, his jaw set in a grim line. Eleanor, ever the picture of refined sorrow, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Brenda, all sharp angles and predatory stillness, had her files spread before her, a general with her battle maps. They had arrived 20 minutes early to claim the strategic high ground. They were on their home turf, a world of corporate power plays and legal maneuvering that they believed Leo could not possibly comprehend. They were waiting for him, and their anticipation was a palpable force in the room. They expected him to arrive flustered, perhaps a little disheveled, carrying a battered briefcase, the very picture of the defeated artist. When Leo walked in, he defied their expectations. He was not flustered. He was preternaturally calm. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored dark gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and no tie. The outfit was understated, but it spoke of a quiet confidence that was deeply unsettling to them. He was not alone. Beside him was George, his own lawyer, who for the first time did not look overwhelmed. In fact, George seemed to be radiating a quiet energy, a secret amusement. "Leo," Brenda began, her voice dripping with condescension, "so glad you could make it. We were just about to start without you." Leo ignored her. He walked to the opposite end of the table and took a seat, placing a single, slim leather portfolio in front of him. He didn't open it. He simply sat, his hands resting calmly on the table, and waited. The silence stretched. It was a power play of his own, and it was working. They had expected a flurry of apologies or defenses. His quiet stillness was a void they felt compelled to fill. "Well," Richard huffed, breaking the silence, "let's get on with it. We all know why we're here. My daughter has been more than patient." Brenda took her cue. She launched into her prepared opening statement, her voice a well-rehearsed symphony of accusation and righteous indignation. She painted a vivid picture of Isabel's decade of sacrifice. She spoke of abandoned career opportunities, of emotional neglect, of a life spent propping up a man who refused to engage with the realities of the world. "My client supported Mr. Vance's artistic pursuits, believing in his potential," Brenda declared, gesturing toward the sorrowful tableau of her clients. But that support was not reciprocated. Instead, her own financial and emotional security was sacrificed for a dream that never materialized, a dream that, by all objective measures, has failed. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the word "failed" hang in the frigid air. "Therefore, we believe our demands are not just reasonable, but are, in fact, a modest compensation for a decade of lost time and opportunity." She then proceeded to read the list of demands aloud, each item a hammer blow designed to crush any remaining spirit Leo might have. The house and all its contents. The 2 cars which she noted were already in my client's possession. 75% of all liquid savings, and alimony payments of $10,000 a month. For life. "This," Brenda concluded with a snap of her file folder, "is our initial and, frankly, quite generous offer. We are prepared to litigate, of course, but we hope Mr. Vance will see the wisdom in avoiding a long, costly, and, frankly, embarrassing public battle that he cannot possibly win." Throughout the entire performance, Leo remained motionless. His expression was unreadable. He listened with the detached interest of a theater critic watching a moderately entertaining, if predictable, play. When Brenda finished, all eyes turned to him. They expected him to argue, to plead, to show some sign of desperation. Isabel leaned forward slightly, a flicker of a triumphant smile playing on her lips. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment of his final, complete surrender. Leo let the silence hang for another long moment. Then he turned to his lawyer. "George," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the room, "would you mind?" George, who had been listening with that same secret amusement, nodded. He stood up, and for a man of his mild appearance, he suddenly seemed to fill the space. "Thank you, Brenda," George began, his tone polite but firm. "That was a compelling piece of fiction. However, we will not be accepting your offer. In fact, we will not be entertaining it in any way." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon." "There's no need to beg," George said smoothly. "My client, Mr. Vance, has a counter-proposal. But before we get to that, there are a few factual inaccuracies in your presentation that we need to correct." He opened his own file, which was considerably thicker than Brenda's. "You claim my client is the financially non-contributing party. But our records show that over the past 5 years, since starting his own firm, Mr. Vance has deposited a total of over $400,000 into their joint accounts from his so-called hobby. Hardly a non-contributing sum." Richard snorted. "400,000 over 5 years? That's 80,000 a year. That's a pittance. I spill more than that." "Perhaps," George conceded, "but it does call into question your narrative of a man who has failed to provide. Furthermore, the down payments for the house and both vehicles were made with funds Mr. Vance earned prior to starting his own firm. Legally, they are tied to his pre-marital assets." Brenda's expression soured. This was not going according to her script. "These are trivialities. The core issue is his earning potential. It's negligible. My client, on the other hand—" The door to the conference room opened. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than the sedan Leo used to drive. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He radiated an aura of immense power and authority. Richard and Brenda stared, confused. Isabel frowned, annoyed at the interruption. Leo smiled. "Ah," he said, "he's early." The man stepped into the room. "Leo, my boy," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Forgive my intrusion. Alistair said you were in a bit of a negotiation. I thought I'd see if I could help move things along." Richard stared, his mouth slightly agape. He recognized the man from the cover of Forbes, from countless articles in the Wall Street Journal. It was Silas Sterling, the Silas Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," Leo said, standing up and shaking his hand warmly, "this is a surprise. I'd like you to meet my wife, Isabel, her parents, Richard and Eleanor, and her counsel, Brenda." Silas Sterling gave them all a brief, dismissive nod. His eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over them and seemed to find them wanting. "A pleasure," he said, the word utterly devoid of warmth. He then turned his full attention back to Leo. "I just came from the City Planning Commission. They are ecstatic. The permits for Helia will be fast-tracked. The Dubai contingent is flying in next week. They want to break ground before the new year." The room fell into a state of absolute stunned silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. The name Helia hung in the air, an unknown word that carried an immense, terrifying weight. Isabel looked from the impossibly famous man at the door to her husband, her mind struggling to connect two completely disparate realities. Helia? What was Helia? The name was vaguely familiar, a half-forgotten whisper. Brenda was the first to find her voice, though it was strained. "I'm sorry. Who are you? And what is this about?" "This is a private legal meeting." Silas Sterling turned his gaze upon her. It was like being pinned by an entomologist. "I am Silas Sterling," he said, as if stating he was breathing air. "And I am Mr. Vance's new business partner. We are partners in the Helia Tower project." He looked back at Leo. "Unless you've neglected to tell them, Leo." Leo gave a small, apologetic shrug. "Things have been complicated." It was Richard who finally made the connection, his face draining of all color. He was a businessman. He read the financial pages. He remembered a small article from a few weeks back about the winner of the prestigious Sterling Prize, an architectural award of global significance. The article had mentioned a revolutionary skyscraper design called Helia, but the architect had been a mysterious, reclusive figure who had submitted under a pseudonym. His mind, which he had so proudly proclaimed was all about assets, finally put the pieces together. The pseudonym, the reclusive artist, the name. "The Sterling Prize," Richard whispered, the words catching in his throat. His eyes darted to Leo, wide with a dawning horror. You won the Sterling Prize?" Silas Sterling beamed, clapping a hand on Leo's shoulder. "He didn't just win it, my friend. He redefined it. This young man's design is going to change architecture as we know it. The prize money, the $2 million, is just the seed capital. This project, Helia Tower, is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor, and Leo is at the helm. $2 million. The number exploded in the silent room like a flash grenade. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her carefully maintained composure shattering. Brenda's jaw literally dropped, her predatory confidence evaporating in an instant. But it was Isabel who had the most profound reaction. Her mind flashed back to the garage, to the dust-covered table, to the jumble of rolled-up papers and the intricate model made of little wooden blocks. She remembered pointing her finger, her voice dripping with contempt. "Just leave all that old trash." That trash. Helia. Her mind reeled. The shame, the humiliation she had so carefully curated for him, turned and rushed back at her like a tidal wave. She was not the wife of a failed artist. She was the wife of a genius she had just tried to publicly, legally, and personally destroy. $2 million? Isabel stammered, the words hollow, empty things. She looked at Leo, truly looked at him, for the first time in years. The quiet man she had dismissed as a dreamer, a failure, was now standing next to one of the most powerful men in the world, being lauded as a visionary. The gray suit she had found merely nice a few minutes ago now looked like the uniform of a man who belonged in rooms like this. Her own expensive power suit suddenly felt like a cheap costume. Leo met her gaze. There was no triumph in his eyes. No, "I told you so." There was only a deep, profound sadness. A quiet mourning for the 10 years they had shared, and for the woman she had failed to be. George, Leo's lawyer, chose this moment to resume his presentation. He was no longer a mild-mannered man. He was an executioner. "So, as I was saying," he continued into the deafening silence, "we need to correct a few factual inaccuracies. The first being Mr. Vance's earning potential." He slid a document across the table. It was a press release from the Sterling Foundation, officially announcing Leo Vance as the prize winner. His photo was at the top. "This $2 million prize, which has already been deposited into a new, separate account in Mr. Vance's name only, constitutes a rather significant change in his financial status. As such, the notion of alimony is, to put it mildly, absurd." Brenda stared at the paper, unable to process it. Her entire case, her entire strategy had been built on the foundation of Leo's failure. That foundation had just been vaporized. And as for the division of assets, George went on, his voice relentless, we can now proceed on a more realistic footing. He pulled another document from his portfolio. It was Leo's counteroffer. Mr. Vance is prepared to offer your client a one-time final settlement of $250,000. The amount, which would have seemed a fortune an hour ago, now sounded like an insult. Richard finally snapped out of his stupor, his face purple with a mixture of rage and humiliation. $250,000? That's it? After he just won $2 million? That's an outrage. We'll see you in court. Silas Sterling, who had been observing the scene with a look of detached amusement, let out a soft chuckle. I wouldn't advise that, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. My legal team is rather more formidable than yours. And the story of a woman who tried to fleece her brilliant husband just before he was revealed to the world as a genius? The press would have a field day with that. Your daughter's reputation, which I gather is important to her, would be utterly ruined. She'd be a laughingstock, a punchline. The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. Go to court, and the full weight of the Sterling Empire would come down upon them. They were not fighting a failed artist anymore. They were fighting a kingmaker. Isabel felt the room begin to spin. The walls were closing in. The confident, triumphant woman who had walked in that morning had been replaced by a terrified, humiliated shell. She looked at her father, whose blustering had been silenced. She looked at her mother, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. She looked at Brenda, whose career was flashing before her eyes. They had no power here. They had been utterly, completely, and irrevocably outplayed. The game she thought Leo wasn't even playing? He hadn't just won. He had owned the entire stadium. She finally looked back at Leo, a desperate, pleading look in her eyes. It was the look of a drowning person searching for a life raft. "Leo," she began, her voice cracking. But he didn't respond. He simply looked at her with that same heartbreaking sadness. He had already mourned their marriage. Now she was just a ghost at the table. The reversal was complete. The powerful were rendered impotent. The underestimated had inherited the earth. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic, undignified collapse. The phalanx of arrogance, so solid just moments before, shattered into a million pieces of desperation. Richard, his face still a mottled shade of crimson, began to sputter, his businessman's mind frantically trying to find a new angle, a new leverage point where none existed. "Now, let's not be hasty," he blustered, trying to direct his words at Silas Sterling, instinctively appealing to the highest power in the room. "This is a family matter. There are nuances here. 10 years of marriage. Isabel has been a supportive partner, a wonderful wife." Silas Sterling cut him off with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of such dismissive power that Richard flinched as if struck. "I have no interest in your family dynamics, sir," Sterling said, his voice cold as a glacier. "I am here to protect my partner and my investment. Mr. Vance's offer is on the table. I suggest you advise your daughter to take it." He then turned to Leo. "Our car is waiting downstairs. The Dubai team is expecting our call in 30 minutes. With a final, withering glance at the wreckage of Isabel's family, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving a vacuum of power in his wake. The departure of the kingmaker left the former court in disarray. Brenda, the shark-like lawyer, was now a beached fish, gasping for air. Her career was built on high-profile wins, not spectacular, humiliating defeats at the hands of world-famous billionaires. She quickly began to gather her papers, her face a mask of professional panic. "Isabel, Richard," she said, her voice tight and low, We need to talk. Privately. She was already in damage control mode, trying to salvage her own reputation. Eleanor, for her part, had dissolved into genuine, racking sobs. Her tears were not for her daughter's failed marriage, but for the catastrophic collapse of their social standing. The story would get out. The wives of the other insurance executives and golf partners would whisper. The pity they had so enjoyed directing at Leo would now be turned on them, magnified 1,000 times. They were no longer the parents of a long-suffering daughter married to a dreamer. They were the parents of a fool who had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. But the most devastating reaction was Isabel's. The shock had subsided, replaced by a frantic, desperate scramble to undo the damage. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She walked around the table toward Leo, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. The power suit no longer looked commanding. It looked like a costume she was swimming in. "Leo," she said, her voice a raw, pleading whisper. "Leo, we can fix this. This is just... it's a misunderstanding. All of this." She gestured vaguely at the room, at her shell-shocked parents, at her retreating lawyer. "It's just lawyers being lawyers. You know that. This doesn't have to be the end." Leo looked at her outstretched hands, but made no move to take them. He saw not a woman seeking reconciliation, but a strategist attempting a last-ditch maneuver. She wasn't trying to get him back. She was trying to get his new life back. "The end happened a long time ago, Isabel," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "This is just the paperwork." The finality in his tone struck her harder than any shout could have. She recoiled, her hands falling to her sides. "But everything I did it for us," she stammered, the lie sounding pathetic even to her own ears. "I was pushing you to be more, to want more. I wanted you to be successful." "No," Leo corrected her, his gaze unwavering. "You wanted me to be successful in a way you could understand. In a way you could show off. You didn't want me to be happy. You wanted me to be impressive." This truth, so simple and so devastating, landed with the force of a physical blow. She had no defense against it, because she knew, in the deepest, most hidden part of her heart, that it was true. Her ambition for him was never about his fulfillment. It was about her validation. George stepped forward, placing the slim leather portfolio containing the counteroffer in front of where Isabel was standing. "The offer of $250,000 is on the table for the next 24 hours, he said, his voice now the epitome of detached professionalism. "After that, it is rescinded, and we will proceed with the standard court-ordered division of assets. Given Mr. Vance's new financial reality and the circumstances of this separation, I can assure you that the outcome of that process will be significantly less favorable for your client." He looked pointedly at Brenda, who had paused at the door. "I trust you will give her sound advice." With that, George nodded to Leo. Leo stood, gave one last, sorrowful look at the woman who had been his wife, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel the thrill of victory. He felt only a profound sense of release, the lightness of a man who has finally set down a burden he has carried for far too long. Isabel was left standing alone at the head of the table, the settlement offer lying before her like a verdict. She looked down at it, then up at the window. At the city skyline her husband was about to change forever. She had wanted a life of status and importance so badly that she had failed to see that she was already living next to it. She had been searching for gold in every direction, never realizing her own house was built on a diamond mine. She had taken the shiny cars and the expensive furniture, and she had left him with the trash. And in doing so, she had made the worst deal of her life. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of her mother's weeping. It was the sound of a world ending. The weeks that followed were a study in diverging trajectories. Leo's life accelerated into a stratosphere he had only ever dreamed of. His days were a whirlwind of meetings with city planners, structural engineers, and the sharp, ferociously intelligent members of the Sterling organization. He flew to London, then to Dubai, staying in hotels where the suites were larger than his old house. He was no longer a solitary artist in a dusty garage. He was the celebrated mind behind the world's most anticipated new building. But through it all, he remained unchanged. The calm, centered man who had walked into that conference room was the same man who now commanded boardrooms. He listened more than he spoke. He treated the junior draftsman with the same respect he gave Silas Sterling. His authority came not from a raised voice or an arrogant posture, but from the unshakable confidence of his vision. The $2 million sat in his account, largely untouched. It was, as Sterling had said, seed money. But more than that, it was proof. It was the tangible validation of his secret work, but he quickly realized the money itself was the least important part of his new reality. What mattered was the respect. What mattered was the freedom to create without compromise. He moved out of the house they had shared, leaving it empty and soulless. He took a minimalist apartment downtown with a stunning view of the skyline, a view he would soon alter. His only possessions from his old life were his books, his tools, and the original dust-covered balsa wood model of Helia. He placed it on a stand in the center of his new living room, a monument not to his victory, but to his perseverance. Isabel's life, in stark contrast, decelerated and then began to crumble. She took the $250,000. Her lawyer, Brenda, had advised her in no uncertain terms that it was a gift. "Take it and run, Isabel. You are lucky they are not suing you for malicious intent." The money seemed like a lot at first, but it evaporated with shocking speed. There were lawyers' fees. There were penalties for breaking the lease on the ostentatious apartment she could no longer afford. There was the cost of maintaining the lifestyle she felt she was entitled to. The silver convertible and the black SUV, once symbols of her status, became crushing liabilities. The insurance payments were astronomical, the gas consumption ruinous. Within 2 months, she had to sell the convertible at a significant loss just to cover her credit card debt. Her world shrank. The friends who had once flocked to her for brunch and gossip now grew distant. Her story, the story of the woman who divorced the secret genius, had become a piece of delicious, cautionary gossip in her social circle. They no longer saw her as a glamorous victim. They saw her as a fool. Her calls went unanswered. Lunch invitations dried up. She was no longer a reflection of their aspirations. She was a reflection of their fears. Her parents were no help. They were trapped in their own spiral of social humiliation. Richard, in a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of status, tried to drop Leo's name at his country club. "My former son-in-law, Leo Vance, you've probably read about him. The Helia Tower." But it backfired spectacularly. The story of the divorce was too well known. His attempts to claim proximity to Leo's success only highlighted his family's spectacular misjudgment. He became an object of pity and quiet ridicule, the very things he had most enjoyed dishing out to others. Eleanor retreated from her social life entirely, canceling her charity lunches and garden club meetings, unable to face the sympathetic, knowing glances of the other women. They had built their entire identity on a foundation of perceived superiority, and that foundation had been exposed as sand. Left with dwindling funds and a shattered social life, Isabel made one last desperate attempt at reconciliation. She found out where Leo was living and showed up at his apartment building unannounced. She had dressed carefully, in a simple, elegant dress reminiscent of the style she wore when they first met. She was trying to remind him of the woman he had fallen in love with. The concierge, A stern woman who guarded the entrance like a fortress called up to his apartment. "Mr. Vance, there is an Isabel Vance here to see you." There was a pause. Isabel held her breath. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of Leo's voice on the other end of the line. Then the concierge's face hardened. "I'm sorry, miss. Mr. Vance is not available to see you. He has asked that you not return." The rejection was a physical blow. Not even available. He hadn't just moved on. He had erased her. She stood on the pavement outside the gleaming glass tower, the city's indifferent crowds flowing around her. She looked up, past the top of the building, toward the sky where her husband was building his dreams. She had finally been pushed to the sidelines, forced to watch the game she had so desperately wanted to play from a distance, with no hope of ever getting back in. The full weight of her choices settled upon her. It wasn't just the money she had lost. It was a future. It was respect. It was the man who had seen beauty in the curve of a bridge, who had tried to show her a world bigger than logos and price tags. He had offered her a universe, and she had settled for a garage full of expensive cars. A year passed. The skyline of the city began to change. The foundation for the first Helia Tower, the flagship project in their own city, which Silas Sterling had managed to pivot to after the Dubai deal expanded, was laid. Its skeletal structure began to rise, a twisting organic form that was already a subject of awe and conversation. It was beautiful. It was hopeful. It looked like the future. Leo Vance was no longer just a name in architectural journals. He was a public figure. He gave talks, accepted awards, and was featured in magazines not for his wealth, but for his ideas about sustainable living and community-focused design. He handled the fame with the same quiet grace with which he had handled the humiliation. He established a foundation of his own, using a portion of his now considerable income to fund scholarships for promising young architecture students from underprivileged backgrounds. He wanted to give others the chance that he had almost been denied. One afternoon, he was walking back to his office from a site meeting. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a work shirt, his face smudged with a bit of dust. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like the man who used to tinker in his garage. He passed a small cafe and happened to glance inside. There, sitting alone at a small table by the window, was Isabel. He almost didn't recognize her. The sharp, aggressive ambition in her features had been replaced by a quiet weariness. Her clothes were simple, tasteful, but without the designer labels she had once considered essential. Her hair was pulled back simply. She was stirring a cup of coffee, her gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. She looked normal. For the first time, she looked like a person, not a performance. On an impulse he didn't fully understand. He walked in. He stopped at her table. "Isabel?" She looked up and her eyes widened in shock. For a moment, fear flickered across her face, as if she expected a reprimand. Then, it settled into a kind of resigned sadness. "Leo," she said, her voice quiet. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. He sat down in the chair opposite her. The silence between them was thick with the weight of everything that had happened. "How are you?" he asked, the question genuine. She gave a small, wry smile. It was the first honest expression he had seen from her in years. "I'm okay," she said. "I have a job in the marketing department of a small nonprofit. It doesn't pay much, but I like the people. They're real." She looked down at her hands. "I sold the house. I live in a small apartment over on the west side. I sold the SUV, too. I take the bus now." She said it all without a trace of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. "I saw the tower," she said, looking out the window in the direction of the construction site. "It's incredible, Leo. It's everything you said it would be." "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and this time the words were not a desperate plea or a strategic maneuver. They were heavy with the weight of genuine regret. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I'm sorry for everything. For not seeing it. For not seeing you. I was so blind, so focused on all the wrong things." Leo listened, and he felt the last lingering embers of his anger and resentment finally turn to ash. He saw before him not the antagonist of his story, but a woman who had been forced to confront the wreckage of her own choices and was slowly, painfully, trying to build something new from the rubble. He saw a glimmer of the woman he had once loved, the one who had gotten lost along the way. "I know," he said. He reached across the table and for a brief moment placed his hand over hers. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but of closure, a gesture of forgiveness. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Isabel." He stood up to leave. "Leo," she called after him. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not destroying me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have, but you didn't. You were fair." He simply nodded, then turned and walked out of the cafe, back into the sunlight of his new life. He didn't look back. He knew the chapter was finally, truly, closed. He had not sought revenge. He had sought justice. And in the end he had achieved something far more valuable: peace. The greatest victory was not in her downfall, but in his own ability to rise above the bitterness and simply let go. He was free, not just from a bad marriage, but from the weight of the past itself. The Helia Tower continued to rise, a testament to the idea that true value is often hidden, waiting patiently for the right time to reveal itself, and that the strongest foundations are built not of steel and concrete, but of integrity, perseverance, and the quiet refusal to let the world tell you what you are worth. In the end, the story of Leo and Isabel became a quiet legend, a modern fable whispered in the boardrooms and cafes of the city. It was a story about the deceptive nature of appearances and the quiet, unshakable power of authentic worth. Leo's Helia Tower became more than just a building. It became a symbol of a new way of thinking. It won countless awards for its design and sustainability, but its true legacy was in the conversation it started about what we value. People would stand on the street below, looking up at its graceful, sun-drenched facade, and they would talk about the man who built it. They would talk about how he worked in secret for years, enduring ridicule and condescension, never losing faith in his own vision. He became an icon of quiet strength, a reminder that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. And what of the others? Richard and Eleanor sold their large house and retired to a small condo in a different state, unable to endure the quiet humiliation of their new social irrelevance. They had spent their lives judging others on a narrow material scale, only to find themselves judged and found wanting by the same metric. Their punishment was not poverty, but obscurity, a fate, for them, far worse. They had lost the one thing they truly worshipped: status. Isabel continued her journey of quiet reinvention. The meeting in the cafe was a turning point. Leo's act of grace, of forgiving her when he had every right to despise her, planted a seed of real change. She stayed at her job with the nonprofit, slowly working her way up, finding a satisfaction in the work that her previous career had never provided. She was no longer performing for an audience. She was simply living. She eventually met someone new, a kind, unassuming teacher who loved her for who she was, not for what she represented. Her life was smaller than the one she had once craved, but it was infinitely richer. She learned, slowly and painfully, that true worth is not something you acquire. It's something you cultivate within. Leo never remarried, but his life was full. He poured his heart into his work, designing buildings that brought beauty and sustainability to cities around the world. His firm, Leo Vance Architecture, became a beacon for young idealistic architects. His true legacy was not in the towers of glass and steel, but in the generation of creators he inspired. He had learned that the ultimate revenge is not to crush your enemies, but to build a life so full of purpose and joy that their memory fades into insignificance. The story serves as a powerful moral mirror, forcing us to look at our own lives. How often do we judge a book by its cover? How often do we dismiss someone's passion as a hobby or their quiet dedication as a lack of ambition? We live in a world that celebrates the loud, the flashy, the instantly successful. We are taught to value the finished product, the gleaming car, the impressive job title, but true genius, true worth, is almost always forged in silence and obscurity. It's forged in the garage in the late hours after everyone else has gone to bed. It's built from little wooden blocks and fueled by a belief that no amount of external doubt can extinguish. So the next time you feel underestimated, the next time someone dismisses your dream, remember Leo. Remember that their judgment is a reflection of their own limitations, not yours. Your value is not determined by their applause. It is determined by your integrity, your passion, and your persistence. Keep working on your trash in the corner. Keep building your secret masterpiece, because you never know when the world will finally be ready to see it for what it truly is. What did you think of Isabel's final transformation? Do you think people who are so focused on status can truly change? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Your perspective makes this community what it is. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of justice and vindication. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and until next time, remember to look for the value that lies beneath the surface.